Bravery often hides in plain sight, and at Midge's Diner in rural Mississippi, it was easy to mistake a single mother for someone who wouldn't fight back. Late afternoon light gleamed off the counter as Tasha Brown and her 6-year-old daughter ordered milkshakes. 3 white men in the corner saw a polite black woman and assumed an easy target. They didn't know Tasha was a former Marine, her instincts and combat training ready to kick in. When their racist taunts turned violent, she would reveal the fierce strength they never saw coming. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the faded asphalt of Route 45, painting long golden stripes on the rusted sign that read, Midge's Diner. Tasha Brown pulled into the gravel parking lot with her daughter Maya, who bounced in the back seat, barely able to contain her excitement at the prospect of a chocolate milkshake. The diner, a low-slung building with peeling white paint and a blue-striped awning, promised the kind of small-town comfort they both needed on a slow Sunday drive. Yet as Tasha cut the engine, she settled into her seat for a moment longer, scanning the horizon beyond the diner's weathered windows. She noticed the stretched fields of cotton and the gnarled live oaks lining the highway, the late spring heat stirring the Spanish moss overhead into a lazy haze. In that instant, Tasha's senses, honed through years of Marine Corps discipline, registered the quiet tension that hung in the air like heavy humidity, as though the land itself were holding its breath for something unseen. When she finally opened the car door, Maya tumbled out with a delighted squeal and darted toward the diner's entrance, her polka-dot sundress flaring around her knees. Tasha followed, retrieving her daughter's hand and steadying her as they stepped onto the sticky blacktop. Inside, the diner's vinyl booths and checkered floor suggested a friendly, small-town atmosphere. But Tasha's posture remained taut with vigilance as she scanned each booth. Her gaze settled on 3 white men in a corner, their shoulders angled toward her and Maya as though they were quietly sizing them up. Ratso's scarred jaw tightened as he watched. Billy's broad shoulders rose in a silent smirk, and Doug's pale eyes narrowed behind a half-empty mug of coffee. Tasha guided Maya into a booth near the window, and Maya's small fingers traced lazy swirls in the sticky tabletop as she waited for their waitress to arrive. The waitress, Crystal, approached with 2 menus, her steps hurried and her eyes darting toward the corner booth. But when Maya rose to her feet and walked toward the counter to fetch a straw, everything changed in an instant. Ratso leaned forward, his voice loud enough to slice the diner's gentle hum. "Hey, little girl, don't you know better than to mess with hair like yours?" Humiliation and confusion clouded Maya's face as Tasha's jaw clenched. The other patrons tensed, and the diner's warmth seemed to drain away. Tasha rose, her height and composure filling the space between Maya and the 3 men, and the faint click of her Marine-erected posture alone was enough to make the men shift uneasily. "You watch your mouth," she said, voice low but fierce, and they reluctantly sank back into their booth under the weight of stares from other customers. Though their sneers remained when Maya returned to her seat, they pretended to back off. But Tasha knew their satisfaction lay hidden behind clenched fists and tight jaws. Midge, the diner's owner, watched from behind the counter, worry flickering in her eyes as she refilled coffee cups. Maya sat back down, her small body trembling, and Tasha knelt beside her, pressing a gentle hand to her daughter's quivering shoulder. "Stay here," Tasha whispered, crouching enough to meet Maya's gaze and offering the calm smile of a mother who would fight if she had to. Maya nodded, biting her lip, and Tasha rose to give Midge a nod of thanks before sliding back into the booth beside her daughter. The waitress Crystal returned moments later with the menus, her eyes avoiding Tasha's, as though afraid to meet the full weight of that maternal glare. A few minutes later, Midge brought their plates, Maya's pancakes dotted with syrup like tiny golden suns, and Tasha's cheeseburger with a side of fries that sizzled on the plate. Yet neither of them touched their food, as Tasha's mind replayed the insult. Maya picked at her pancakes with wide eyes, and Tasha forced herself to take a bite of the burger, savoring the familiar comfort of the melted cheese and toasted bun, even as every marine instinct warned that this encounter was far from over. The three men sat in silence, their hostility simmering beneath forced civility, and although they refrained from further overt remarks, their glances continued to track Tasha and Maya as though determined to mark their next move. When they finished eating, Tasha placed a $10 bill on the table and gathered Maya's hand, guiding her toward the exit. Patrons watched as Tasha rose, her grip on Maya's hand firm, her back straight with the unspoken promise of protection. Outside, the late afternoon heat hung thick over the gravel lot as Tasha guided Maya toward the car, confident that the lingering warmth of their brief respite would chase away any lingering unease. Yet before Maya's small hand could reach the open passenger door, a gravelly voice called out from behind. Tasha paused, her marine-trained instincts flaring to full alert as she sensed the three men slipping from the diner's shadows to surround them. Billy Carter stepped forward first, his heavy leather boot crunching against loose stones, and he offered a twisted smile that revealed more menace than mirth. "Leaving so soon, sweetheart?" he hissed, dark eyes glinting with cruelty. Ratso and Doug flanked him, closing the circle with silent satisfaction, their broad frames blotting out the weak sunlight like a gathering storm. Tasha's chest tightened, but she refused to let fear show. She slipped Maya's hand from her own and gently guided her onto the back seat, making sure the child was tucked safely behind the closed car door. Maya's wide eyes brimmed with confusion at the sudden tension. Tasha locked the doors with a practiced flick of her wrist, the click of the locks sounding like the pull of a safety catch on a rifle. She turned to face the three men, arms relaxed, but ready to spring into action if necessary. "I suggest you walk away," Tasha said, her voice containing steel beneath the calm. "I don't want trouble, and neither does my daughter." But the men did not retreat. Instead, Billy took a step closer, the soles of his boots scuffing the gravel as he leaned in. "Trouble? We're just having a little fun, lady," he snarled, spitting the words out as though they carried a challenge. Before Tasha could respond, Ratso reached toward the passenger window, prying at the edge of the glass as though he intended to slip his hand inside. Maya shrank into the seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and Tasha's pulse spiked. She spread her feet, coiled like a spring ready to tighten, and when Ratso yanked the arm of her jacket, her training took over without hesitation. She pivoted on her heel, planted her foot squarely against Ratso's chest, and shoved him backward with such force that he stumbled and crashed into his companions. The suddenness of her movement startled Billy and Doug enough to make them hesitate, but they quickly regained their footing and lunged forward. Tasha's senses sharpened, the scent of gasoline and cigarette smoke mixing in the air like an omen, the scrape of knives in Doug's pocket, the glint of metal at Ratso's waist. Instinct compelled her to protect Maya at all costs. As Ratso scrambled upright, blinking away sparks of pain from Tasha's first blow, Tasha's fist swung in a tight arc, connecting with his jaw in a strike refined by years of Marine combatives training. He reeled backward, off balance, and Tasha pivoted toward Billy, who now advanced with a broken bottle clutched in his fist as though it were a crude weapon. "You think you can scare us, girl?" Billy sneered, his shoulders hunched with hatred as he lunged forward. Tasha caught his wrist in a vice-like grip, twisting with deliberate precision until the bottle shattered against the gravel in a shower of glass. "You misjudge me," she replied evenly, her eyes cold and unwavering despite the afternoon's oppressive heat. Billy lurched forward, face contorted with rage, but before he could recover, Tasha shifted her weight, and delivered a powerful knee strike to his midsection, folding him against the hood of the car with a guttural groan. His breath rasped in and out, and he slumped momentarily as though the air itself had turned to iron. At that same instant, Doug, jaw set and eyes aflame, charged from Billy's side, using his bulk to drive forward. "You'll regret this," he snarled, swinging a heavy fist toward Tasha's temple. She sidestepped with fluid grace, planting her elbow firmly against his ribs. "I'm done listening to your hatred," she said, her voice soft but lethal. Then she spun, her palms slamming into his temple in a strike that echoed in the still, late-afternoon air. Doug's knees buckled, and he collapsed backward onto the gravel as though some invisible strings had been severed. Ratso, recovering from Tasha's earlier impact, staggered to his feet, spittle flying from the corner of his mouth as he glared at her. "You're just a woman," he snarled, his voice thick with spite. "You don't belong here." He sprinted forward, roaring with fury, his fist colliding with Tasha's shoulder with a force that ripped through her, sending a hot flare of pain across her side. She stumbled, the blow knocking her off balance for a heartbeat, but she refused to yield. Blood welled from where tiny shards from the broken bottle had scraped her skin, and though each move threatened to leave her reeling, she spun out of Ratso's path, redirected his momentum, and leveraged him to the ground with a jarring thud. Billy, though wounded and gasping, drew himself to his feet once more, his left arm now hanging uselessly at his side. Desperate, he flung himself at Tasha, fists flailing in a last attempt to overpower her. "Think you're so tough?" he spat, adrenaline surging as he swung at her face. She met his lunge head-on, her right forearm colliding with his jaw, in a blow that rattled his skull as though it were filled with shattered glass. He staggered back, disoriented and clutching his jaw, but Tasha offered him no respite. She shifted her stance and drove her knee into his chest, sending him sprawling onto the hood of the car, his body twisting like a rag doll too broken to resist. From the corner of her eye, Tasha saw Doug stir and attempt to rise, a fresh glint of anger in his eyes, despite the impact that had left him dazed on the gravel. She met his sterile gaze with unflinching resolve. As Doug rolled to his knees, blinking through a veil of pain, he produced a kitchen knife from his pocket, a jagged scrap of metal glinting with menace. "I'll show you what happens when you cross us," he snarled, lunging once more with frenzied desperation. Tasha's senses, sharpened beyond ordinary reckoning, flared. She ducked beneath his swing, the blade whistling inches above her cheek and leaving a feathery trail of her hair in its wake. The sting where glass had nicked her forearm flared white-hot, but she suppressed the pain. In one fluid motion, she slid behind Doug, wrapped her arm around his bicep, and twisted until he cried out, the knife clattering to the dirt. With a decisive downward strike of her elbow, she drove into the base of his skull. Doug collapsed face first into the gravel, his body going limp at the edges of consciousness. Ratso, the only one who remained upright, staggered forward in a last crusade of fury, his fists still seeking purchase on Tasha's battered form. He managed to connect with her side, the force sending her ajar and pain lancing through her ribs as though they had been replaced by barbed wire. She coughed, tasting copper and grit, but she refused to yield. She forced herself to her feet, each breath scorching as it passed her injured throat, and the sight of Maya's wide, fearful eyes pressed against the passenger window steeled her resolve once more. She sprang forward in a blur of motion, her boot connecting with Ratso's shin and sending him tumbling back. He rose again, defiant despite his injuries, but Tasha anticipated his movements. She ducked beneath his next swing and drove her elbow into his temple, bone striking bone in a sickening crack that sent him reeling sideways. Ratso slumped to one knee, his head hanging, a thin trickle of blood tracing from his lip to the gravel below. Billy, regaining his breath and half conscious of the danger, attempted to crawl toward the remnants of the broken bottle as though his survival hinged on that jagged steel. But Tasha's gaze, fierce with protective fire, held him in place. She launched herself forward, her movement honed by countless drills until it was practically instinct. Her boot connected with Billy's ribs in a precise front kick, sending him skidding across the gravel before he crashed to a halt in a spray of dust and pebbles. He lay there, too winded to move, the fight nearly burned from his frame. Tasha did not hesitate. She moved back to Ratso and took him by the scruff of his collar, dragging him to his feet and using her entire weight to propel him neck first into the car's door. The hollow thud resonated in the quiet, and Ratso slid to the ground, spent and vulnerable. At that moment, as dusk began casting long shadows across the parking lot, the wail of sirens sliced through the settling gloom. Tasha rose slowly, chest heaving with exhaustion, her shirt clinging to her skin in a slick of sweat and blood. She wiped at her mouth with the back of her hand, tasting salt and grit, but her gaze remained fixed on Maya, whose small face pressed against the passenger window. Behind them, Billy stirred weakly. Ratso writhed in the gravel, and Doug lay still, but breathing raggedly. Tasha's jaw tightened as she realized the men still clung to consciousness and would not surrender here. She kept her breathing steady, sliding her hand around Maya's so the child would know she was not alone. By the time the first patrol car turned onto the highway, the three assailants, all shaken, bleeding, and limping, had staggered to their feet and slipped into the deepening shadows at the edge of the lot. They moved in twisted unison, each seeking cover beneath the nearby stands of pines that lined the highway. Tasha stood by the open car door as deputies stepped onto the gravel, flashlights carving arcs of pale light across the blood-stained ground. She remained where she was, chest rising and falling, while one deputy, dark-haired and young, approached with measured steps, radio clipped to his shoulder. Maya sat clutching her stuffed rabbit, eyes wide and trembling, but neither made a sound. The deputy knelt at a respectful distance. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked quietly, glancing from Tasha's battered face to Maya's wide, frightened eyes. His partner lingered behind him, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Tasha straightened, folding her arms as though bracing against invisible currents. "They attacked us," she said, voice low but steady. "They surrounded us in the parking lot, then tried to grab my daughter." She pointed toward the thicket where shadows shifted. "They ran that way when they saw you coming." The deputy nodded and tapped his radio. "Suspects fled on foot," he reported calmly. "We'll check the perimeter." He glanced back at Tasha, concern flickering in his eyes. "Do you want to press charges?" Tasha's gaze drifted to Billy crumpled against the hood of the car. He still breathed, but his expression was blank. Ratso and Doug were nowhere to be seen, already slipping away on wounded legs. "Yes," she said, each word firm. "I want them arrested. They started this. They attacked me and my daughter." The deputy scribbled in his notepad as Tasha recounted each blow, each insult, her voice unwavering even as her body trembled from exertion. Beside her, Maya's trembling grip on her rabbit tightened, and Tasha reached down, brushing a stray curl from Maya's forehead. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" she murmured. Maya shook her head. Terror lingered in her eyes, but tears did not fall. When Tasha finished, the deputy replaced his notepad and exchanged a quick look with his partner. He tapped the radio. "Nothing on foot yet. No sign of suspects. They must have slipped into the woods." He turned back to Tasha. "We'll run their descriptions," he said. "Countywide alert for 3 white males, late 20s. The other deputy nodded and shifted his weight, waiting for direction. "We'll need statements from you and your daughter," he continued, but his tone hinted at resignation. Without them, this is going to be difficult. They're already gone. Tasha's hands curled into fists. They were right here, she said quietly. They can't just slip away. The deputy sighed, stepping back. We're obligated to search, but if they're as injured as they appeared, they probably have a head start. He hesitated, then added, I'll give you the number of the victim advocate. They'll help with filing. We'll take your name and address, and if they turn up, we'll act. Tasha's chest tightened. She watched him radio in her statement, his words becoming static over the speaker, as if sealing away her pleas. Maya whimpered softly, pressing her body closer to her mother. Tasha bent to gather her quietly into her arms. We'll find another way, she whispered, though every fiber of her Marine's honed discipline knew they were at the mercy of local law enforcement's limited reach. The deputy straightened and offered a curt nod. We'll keep an eye out, he said, though neither his expression nor his tone suggested true commitment. He stepped back, and within seconds, the patrol cars turned around and rolled away, their taillights slicing through the dusk until only the thickening shadows remained. Tasha cradled Maya's head against her shoulder, feeling the tremors ripple through her daughter's small frame. Every inch of her body still burned with pain, her ribs stinging where she'd taken blows, but there was no relief in sight. The men who had attacked them were gone. Gone into the night, protected by a local system that was skewed in their favor. When the last patrol car disappeared around the bend, Tasha slid into the driver's seat, hoisting Maya onto her lap. The moment their bodies touched, Maya's small arms tightened around her neck. Tasha forced a reassuring smile, even as tears she refused to show threatened to slip free. We're going to Aunt Lorraine's, she said, turning the key. The engine roared to life, a dull promise of motion. Slowly, she guided the car onto the highway, each mile marker passing in a blur of fading orange sky and looming pines. As they drove in painful silence, Tasha felt the weight of her promise settle into her bones. Justice would not come from the sheriff's deputies tonight. It would come from her own determination, fueled by every scar she bore, every lesson she learned in combat. Maya nestled against her mother's side, eyes closed as though drifting toward sleep, and Tasha stared at the road ahead, the headlights illuminating fine dust motes in the humid air. Every inhalation reminded her of the fight just ended, every exhale a vow not to surrender. No indifferent patrol car or half-hearted statement would dissuade her. She would track them down, Billy, Ratso, and Doug, whoever they were, until they faced the consequences of their hatred. As the farmhouse lights of Aunt Lorraine's property came into view, Tasha pressed her foot down, her jaw set, and her heart steeled for the next battle. That evening, Tasha sat on the edge of Aunt Lorraine's couch, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating the evidence of destruction that still lingered in her mind. Each time she closed her eyes, the memory of Ratso's snarling face and the sudden flash of his hand against the car's window played like a broken film reel, looping through her thoughts until she could almost feel the sting of that strike across her ribs. Maya slept soundly in the guest room, her breathing gentle and even, unaware that her mother's resolve had crystallized into something fiercer than fear. Tasha's fingers trembled as she replayed the parking lot confrontation in her mind, recalling the rapid succession of blows, the taste of sweat and blood that lingered on her tongue as she fought to protect her daughter. She refused to allow Maya's safety to hinge on passive hope, because, for every mile they put between themselves and the diner, the three men who had attacked them could slip further into the protective cloak of local loyalties. When dawn broke the next morning, the farmhouse felt cloaked in silent anticipation, as though the world held its breath in the humid air. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains while the cicadas droned outside, their song a constant reminder that life continued even as threats lingered beyond the farmhouse walls. Aunt Lorraine stood at the kitchen counter, humming a hymn as she placed fresh biscuits on a plate. The familiar aroma of sizzling bacon and strong coffee eased Tasha's tension only slightly. Maya sat at the table in her pajamas, tracing shapes in the condensation on her glass of milk, and Tasha offered her a soft smile as she poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. "Eat your breakfast, baby," Tasha whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Maya's forehead. "Aunt Lorraine made your favorite." Maya nodded, dipping a biscuit into golden syrup, but her eyes flicked nervously to the farmhouse door each time it creaked on its hinges. Aunt Lorraine caught Tasha's gaze and reached across the table to squeeze her hand, offering a quiet, unwavering support that steadied her resolve. "Go get justice, Tasha," she said, voice firm but tender. "They can't get away with this." Tasha pressed her lips together, nodded, and rose from the table, leaving Maya and Aunt Lorraine to finish breakfast as she stepped out into the bright morning light. The old Chevy waited in the gravel drive, and as she closed the door behind her, the world outside felt impossibly large and infinitely small all at once. The drive to the sheriff's office was short, but felt interminable. Every mile marker flashed past in a blur, each jostle in the suspension eliciting a wince from Tasha as she recalled the ache in her bruised ribs. She parked in front of the brick facade of the Rowan County Sheriff's Department, its windows catching the early sun in harsh glints that reflected off dust-speckled glass. The narrow sidewalk felt warmer under her feet as she climbed the steps, two at a time, the weight of determination bearing down on her like a physical burden. Maya stayed behind with Aunt Lorraine, having refused to accompany her mother into that place of authority where Tasha already felt so profoundly betrayed. Inside, the sheriff's office was a cramped, cluttered space, papers strewn across desks, outdated calendars pinned to corkboards, and faded photographs of officers staring down from the walls. Tasha drew a breath to steady herself as she stepped through the threshold, Maya's protective hug still echoing in her memory. Sheriff Earl Thompson sat behind his desk, its surface littered with coffee-stained paperwork and a tarnished nameplate that proclaimed his title. When Tasha's large frame filled the doorway, the sheriff's head lifted, and a polite smile flickered across his face, but it did not extend to his eyes. He recognized her wounded countenance from the descriptions that had undoubtedly circulated through his deputies the night before. "Sheriff Thompson," she began, her voice steady, though each word felt like a heavy weight in her chest. "I came to press charges." She set a small envelope on his desk. Inside lay her phone, open to the corner of the screen that displayed nothing but a frozen frame of Ratso's hand smashing against the car window. The sheriff propped on his elbows, leaning forward to examine the faded image and the digital files she had pulled from Maya's account. His expression remained polite, but he sighed as if he bore the weight of history on his shoulders. "I'm sorry for what happened to you and your daughter," he said, voice smooth as worn leather. "But I can't go against family." Tasha's eyes narrowed, and her fists clenched into tight knots at her sides. "You said it yourself. Family," she replied, every syllable deliberate. "Ratso's uncle is the brother of your cousin, isn't he? That does not excuse 3 men attacking my child and me. My daughter could have been killed." Sheriff Thompson leaned back in his chair, uncrossing his arms and adjusting the cuffs of his uniform. "Loyalty to blood is a powerful thing," he said, his tone calm as though discussing the weather. "This county depends on alliances. Some things are better left unspoken." Tasha pressed her lips into a thin line, the air around her crackling with restrained fury. "So you're telling me that because of his blood, Ratso will never face a day in court for what he did?" Sheriff Thompson folded his hands atop the desk, pale knuckles tightening into white. "You're aware of the consequences when you try to challenge that kind of protection," he said, voice heavy with unspoken threats. Billy Carter and Doug Wilson have fathers who own half the land in this county. They can ruin you, if they want to." Tasha's heart hammered like a war drum, but she refused to let fear take root. "I will find justice," she said, voice low and unwavering. "Even if it has to come from higher up." The sheriff leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing into slits that glinted with a hint of rancor. "There's a state patrol headquarters in Jackson," he said, almost reluctantly. "You can try there. Federal charges, hate crime, something. I can't help you here." Tasha exhaled, a tremor of relief laced with bitterness coursing through her. "Thank you," she replied, though her fists remained clenched at her sides. "I will." She turned toward the door, but the sheriff called after her, soft as a ghost's breath. "Be careful, Ms. Brown. Some things can't be undone." Tasha spared him a final glance, her eyes filled with a promise of accountability that the sheriff would eventually come to regret. And then she strode out of the office, closing the door behind her with a quiet determination that echoed through the narrow hallway. She paused to gather Maya's hand from Aunt Lorraine's arms in the lobby, where Crystal, the waitress, stood against a chipped water cooler, eyes downcast, guilt etched into every line of her face. Crystal's lips parted, as though to say something, but no words came. Tasha's jaw set. "Thank you for that information about Aunt Lorraine's farmhouse," she said quietly. Crystal nodded once, her gaze flickering toward the closed office door. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Tasha offered a brief nod of acknowledgement, but did not break her stride. Outside, the morning sun beat down on the courthouse steps as Tasha climbed into her Chevy, Maya settling into her seat with an expectant look. Every muscle in her body ached as she turned the key and rolled backward off the curb, the car's engine humming with promise. As she merged onto the highway, the sheriff's office receding in her rearview mirror, she felt a surge of resolve wash over her. The next step was Jackson, where federal agents would be her only hope for justice. The road stretched out before them, an open ribbon of promise and peril under a sky the color of struggle. And as the farmhouse lights of Aunt Lorraine's property faded into the distance, Tasha's motherly vow burned ever brighter. No amount of blood ties would shield those men from the consequences of what they had wrought. Back at the farmhouse, the late morning sun poured through swaying pecan trees, turning the air into a shimmering haze. Tasha guided Maya inside, brushing a bead of sweat from the child's brow, as Aunt Lorraine stepped onto the porch, a hand shielding her eyes against the glare. "We need to make sure this place is as secure as it can be," Aunt Lorraine said, voice steady despite the tremor of worry in her eyes. Together, they set to work boarding windows with plywood planks and hammering nails with the precision of seasoned hands. Every clang of metal on wood echoed through the dusty air like a summons of war, yet Tasha refused to let her energy flag. Each board elevated around them was another barrier between Maya and those who sought their destruction. Tasha's marine instincts guided her actions as she installed motion-activated lights around the perimeter, each one clicking into place with deliberate care. She drilled into aged wood and set the sensors in hidden corners, ensuring no intruder could slip in darkness undetected. Maya, perched on a rickety ladder beside her, held nails in a small tin, her wide eyes tracing every movement with a mixture of fascination and lingering fear. "Mommy," Maya asked quietly, "what if they try again?" Tasha paused, pressing a palm against the wall beneath the highest light sensor. "Then we will be ready," she answered firmly, voice soft but unwavering. "You know what to do. Stay calm, stay inside, and wait for me." Maya nodded, fingers curling around the edge of the ladder, and Tasha wrapped her arm around her daughter's waist before lowering her to solid ground. Below, Aunt Lorraine secured the last board on the kitchen window, with nails driven home as if forging armor. That night, the farmhouse settled into a tense hush that seemed to amplify every creak of floorboard and rustle of wind through the surrounding oaks. Maya's mattress had been moved to Aunt Lorraine's room for company and comfort, but sleep remained elusive for the child. Tasha lay on the edge of Maya's bed, gently stroking her daughter's hair, as soft sobs shook the child's small frame. "Mommy," Maya whispered, voice trembling. "I had bad dreams. I heard them laughing. I saw the fire." Tasha felt her chest tighten at the confession, but she pressed a kiss to Maya's temple, bending low to look into eyes dimmed by fright. "It was just a dream, sweetheart," she murmured. "You're safe here with me. I won't let anything happen to you." Maya's tears clung to her lashes, and she nodded, burying her face into Tasha's shoulder as though seeking refuge from a storm that had not yet broken. Tasha sighed quietly, rousing herself to walk into the living room, where Aunt Lorraine knelt before the window, offering hushed prayers to a God who she believed was both protector and deliverer. The next morning, Tasha rose before dawn, her bones still aching from the makeshift boardwork and the unrelenting tension of the night. In the dim glow of a single lamp, she retrieved her phone and dialed Colonel Mark Reynolds in Washington, D.C., her former commanding officer. The line cracked to life, and after an exchange of warm greetings, interrupted by her shaking voice, Tasha explained what had transpired. The diner attack, the parking lot confrontation, the sheriff's refusal, and her own mounting fear. She sent him the audio recording of Crystal's confession, shaky and tearful, in which Crystal admitted that her brother had fallen into crippling debt with a man named Raven, an informant Tasha had once delivered over during her time in the Corps. Colonel Reynolds's voice on the other end conveyed both concern and urgency. "Tasha, I'll push this to the Department of Justice. We need every bit of evidence you can muster before Friday closes. If not, local interference will stall everything." Tasha swallowed hard. "Understood, sir. We have 4 days." Reynolds's response came in a solemn promise. "I won't let you down." Later that afternoon, with the sun high and the farmhouse cool in its shade, Tasha slipped into the passenger seat of her Chevy and made the short drive to the diner. Maya and Aunt Lorraine stayed behind, sharing quiet conversation over the hum of ceiling fans. At the diner, Crystal hovered by the register until Tasha appeared. Crystal guided her to a back booth, her eyes rimmed red from tears she had not yet shed. Tasha sat down, the booth's vinyl seat cool against her jeans, and regarded Crystal for a long moment before speaking. "I need the truth," she said, her voice measured, betraying neither anger nor pity. Crystal's lips quivered as she swallowed, folding her hands in her lap. "My brother owed Billy Carter's uncle," she began, fumbling for words that would free her from guilt. "His name was Raven. He worked as a bounty informant back in Afghanistan, Operation Ironclad. He tried to blow the whistle on a corrupt supply chain, and when the higher-ups found out, they used my brother to leverage the family. Raven disappeared after I turned him in." Tasha's heart constricted at the revelation. The wrinkles of betrayal spanned across years and continents, a vendetta reaching back to Tasha's own service. Crystal's voice broke as she continued, "I promised I would stay out of it, but they threatened to burn down Aunt Lorraine's home. They said they wanted revenge for Raven. They plan to set the barn on fire 2 nights from now, on Friday." She slid a small envelope across the table, revealing phone records and text messages that outlined the date and the burnt orange imagery of gasoline-soaked rags. Tasha took a deep breath, the full weight of Crystal's confession settling like stones in her stomach. "So it wasn't random," Tasha murmured, her voice catching. "They targeted us because of Raven." Crystal's shoulders shook as a single tear slipped free. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted this." Tasha folded her hands around the envelope, feeling its edges stiff with evidence, and nodded. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "You gave me time to prepare." That evening, the farmhouse lay under a blanket of tense anticipation. The cicadas sang outside like a chorus of distant warnings, and the boards over the windows reflected a flickering of nerves beneath the calm. Tasha assigned Aunt Lorraine to the living room with a shotgun resting against her feet, and taught Maya how to stay calm if someone appeared at the door, sit on the floor by the stairs, and remain silent until she and Aunt Lorraine could respond. Once Maya was tucked into bed, Tasha moved through the rooms collecting medical supplies, gauze, antiseptic, bandages, and a small kit of pain relievers. She laid them out on a side table, arranging them as though preparing for surgery. Next, she retrieved a small pistol from an old wooden chest, her service weapon, now cleaned and kept in a locked case, and slipped it into her belt, an unspoken promise that she would stand sentry against the darkness. Aunt Lorraine knelt in the hallway, Bible open, the flicker of candlelight casting shadows that danced against the walls. "I prayed for your safety and for justice this morning," she whispered, voice quivering between hope and fear. Tasha paused, resting her hand on her aunt's shoulder. "Thank you," she said, tone raw but grateful. "I won't let them burn this place or hurt Maya." Aunt Lorraine nodded, tears shining in her eyes as she lowered herself onto the floor, her shoulders shaking in earnest prayer. Tasha stepped into the cool night air, taking a deep breath as the distant hum of cicadas wrapped around her. She pictured the perimeter around the barn, the motion-activated lights she had installed, each one casting broad beams of illumination over a once vulnerable landscape. In her mind, she ran through scenarios, how Ratso would approach, the flash of a lighter against a gasoline trail, the crackle of fire, until each scenario collapsed under the certainty that she would not fail. Inside, Maya slept at last, her small chest rising and falling in the dim glow of the hallway. Aunt Lorraine still knelt, her whispered prayers weaving through the hush of the house. Tasha took one final look at the boarded windows and the reinforced doors, each guard in place as if the farmhouse had become a fortress. She collected Maya's favorite stuffed rabbit and tucked it beneath her own pillow, promising through her silence and her resolve that nothing would pass through those defenses without consequence. The farmhouse exhaled with a gathering stillness that carried the weight of what was to come. A storm Tasha would face head-on, armed with every grain of her Marine training and every ounce of her love for her daughter. It was Thursday morning, 2 days before the deadline, and 1 day before the planned arson, when the farmhouse truly settled into its role as a fortress. Tasha secured the final boarded window with firm hammer blows, each nail driven home a silent promise that no intruder would breach their sanctuary. At the foot of her bed, she placed a pistol beneath her pillow, its cold metal outline a quiet reassurance for the long hours to come. Maya watched from the corner, clutching her rabbit-stuffed toy, tears brimming in her eyes as she studied her mother's determined expression. Tasha knelt beside her daughter, brushing a loose curl from Maya's forehead. "Soon, this will be over," she whispered, forcing a light smile that did nothing to hide the tension in her features. Beyond the room's threshold, Aunt Lorraine stood on the porch, Bible open in her lap, murmuring fervent prayers that drifted through the summer breeze and wove themselves around the farmhouse's reinforced doors. Inside, Tasha sat at the small kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as she uploaded the updated evidence, video from the parking lot, Crystal's recorded confession, and Ratso's clear identification, to a secure Department of Justice portal. Each file transferred carried the weight of their safety, and she watched the progress bar inch forward with anxious anticipation. When the final clip appeared on the screen, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Tasha?" Colonel Mark Reynolds's voice was warm over the line. Relief and anticipation tangled in her chest as she responded, "Yes, sir." He confirmed receipt of every file and informed her that agents would interview her at 9 o'clock Friday morning in Jackson. "We'll act as swiftly as possible," he assured her. "But I need you ready." She swallowed and nodded, even though he could not see her. "Understood. Thank you, Colonel." When she hung up, the farmhouse felt both heavier and lighter. Heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead, yet lighter with the knowledge that reinforcements were coming. Still, Tasha could not rest. As the afternoon sun sank lower, she slipped into her Chevy and drove toward the diner, the engine's hum a steady pulse under her skin. The road stretched out like a ribbon of promise and peril, and every shadow that flickered against the fields seemed to conceal danger. When she slid into the diner's back booth, Crystal stood hesitantly with downcast eyes. Tasha's voice held both urgency and compassion as she said, "I need the truth, Crystal. Now." Crystal's lip trembled as she revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Her brother had fallen into deep debt to Billy Carter's uncle, Raven, the very informer Tasha had once delivered. With a cracked voice, Crystal confessed that they planned to burn Aunt Lorraine's property at 9 o'clock Friday night. She slid a small envelope across the table, its contents revealing phone records and text messages that confirmed the barn was to be set ablaze. Shock and guilt washed over Tasha as the realization settled. This assault was not random racism, but a vendetta tied to Raven's fate. Tasha's fingers tightened around the envelope's edge before she rose. "Thank you," she said softly, then slipped away before anyone noticed her eavesdropping. As she drove home under a copper sky, the final rays of daylight painted the road in fiery streaks, and every rustle of the wind felt like a whisper of warning on her neck. Shadows reached across the pavement, each one a potential threat. When she finally pulled into the gravel driveway, dusk had fallen like a velvet curtain. The farmhouse lights glowed softly, and Aunt Lorraine stood on the porch, framed by the porch rail and the porch light's gentle halo. Her silhouette fell across the wooden steps as she called, "Tasha, come inside." Tasha exhaled, swallowing the tension that knotted her throat, and climbed the steps 2 at a time. "They'll come tonight," Aunt Lorraine said, her voice heavy with sorrow. Tasha simply nodded, pressing a hand to Maya's shoulder as the child slumped into her arms, exhaustion overtaking terror. She tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear and spoke quietly, "Stay indoors at all times, Maya. I'll be right here." Friday arrived with sweltering heat and tangled nerves, the air so thick it felt like a barrier with every breath. Tasha woke before dawn and gently shook Maya awake. "Time for breakfast, baby," she whispered, guiding her to the screened porch where soft sunlight painted golden patterns on the floorboards. Maya's hair lay tousled from nightmares, and she pressed her face to her mother's side as Aunt Lorraine moved about the kitchen, flipping biscuits and ladling gravy onto plates. The aroma of warm biscuits mingled with strong coffee brewing on the stove, and though comfort awaited them in the familiar ritual, Tasha's mind danced among defensive strategies for what lay ahead. After breakfast, Aunt Lorraine fussed with the final touches on the farmhouse's defenses. She laid fresh boards under the windowsill and straightened the chairs so that Maya could hide behind them if need be. Meanwhile, Tasha double-checked her shotgun and tactical vest, ensuring every strap was secure and every shell properly seated. Each click and clamp of metal against metal echoed through the quiet house, a testament to hours spent overseas where similar routines had meant the difference between life and death. Maya watched her mother work, eyes wide with measured hope, and Tasha offered her a gentle nod. "I need a few more minutes, baby," she said, and Maya returned her rabbit toy to her stuffed animal pile before slipping away to play quietly. At 9 o'clock on the dot, Tasha stepped into the rented car awaiting her in Jackson. Colonel Mark Reynolds stood beside two Department of Justice agents, Agent Carter and Agent Williamson, beneath the harsh glow of a street lamp. The interview room they led her into was windowless and cool, the fluorescent lights bouncing off metal folding chairs that circled a single table. Tasha took a seat, her posture straight, every muscle braced as though preparing for battle. Agent Carter placed a recorder on the table and nodded, signaling her to begin. She recounted every detail: the diner's fluorescent hum, Ratso's sudden swipe at her car, the rush of harrowing blows in the parking lot, Sheriff Thompson's refusal to act, and Crystal's reluctant cooperation. Her voice remained steady, even as she described the gang's intent to burn down Aunt Lorraine's home at 9 o'clock that very night, the words cutting through the room like a blade drawn from a sheath. Carter's gaze remained level as he listened, nodding grimly at each revelation. When she finished, he exchanged a look with Agent Williamson, then turned back to her. "We'll move on a contempt notice for the sheriff and press local charges as soon as possible," he said, voice grave. "Your evidence is strong, and we'll expedite a federal hate crime investigation, but you must protect your family this evening." Relief and anticipation tangled in Tasha's chest, but she could not rest. She simply nodded and rose from the table. Back at the farmhouse, the oppressive heat of the late afternoon clung to every surface. The porch swung gently in the breeze, and Maya sat upon the steps, clutching her rabbit toy as though it were the last barrier between her and danger. Aunt Lorraine shaded her eyes against the sun, her face etched with worry. Tasha stepped from the heated shade of the car into the yard, her boots crunching against the gravel. She crossed to the porch and knelt before Maya, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "Tonight, we stay inside," she said quietly, voice steady, though her heart pounded like a war drum. "No matter what you hear, you stay right here." Maya nodded, swallowing hard as tears threatened to spill again. Tasha clasped her hands gently and stood, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, she said simply, "I promise I'll protect you, baby. I won't let them harm us." Aunt Lorraine rose to her feet and murmured her own silent prayer, while Tasha moved into the farmhouse, each step taken with deliberate resolve, fully aware that with nightfall, the storm they had been bracing for would finally break. The sky had bled into a bruised purple by the time Ratso's truck rattled onto the gravel driveway, tires kicking up dust that shimmered in the fading light like embers waiting to ignite. Ratso, Doug, and Billy tumbled from the vehicle with jerry cans and rags in hand, the gasoline's scent sharp on the humid air, as though seeping from their pores. The barn loomed at the edge of Aunt Lorraine's property, its weathered siding hunched beneath a canopy of pine boughs. Ratso flicked a glance toward Tasha's farmhouse, where motion-activated lights danced against the windows, each flash a reminder that their prey was prepared. Doug and Billy advanced toward the barn's side, baseball caps pulled low over their eyes, as Ratso knelt to pour gasoline along the length of the boards with methodical slowness. "You think you can hide here, boy?" Billy snarled, his voice filigreed with malicious anticipation. "You ain't safe anywhere." Tasha emerged from the shadows near the farmhouse porch, shotgun held loosely but firmly at her side, her pulse a measured throb in her ears as every marine instinct flared to life. The world seemed to narrow into the space between her and the barn, the scent of diesel mixing with the fading sweetness of honeysuckle on the breeze. She stepped into the pale orange glow of the perimeter lights, her posture unyielding. "Stay away from that barn," she commanded, her voice ringing across the field as though any crack in her resolve would signal weakness to the men she faced. Ratso's head snapped up, and his eyes widened at the sight of her, the firelight dancing across his scarred cheeks, "You can't stop us," he snarled, his teeth bared as he shoved the spout from another jerry can into Doug's waiting hand. Billy dropped to one knee to light a rag on the lip of the jerry can, and in that instant, Tasha's training took over. She pivoted, shouldering the shotgun to fire at the yellow metal container resting on the gravel. The blast of flame that erupted sent gasoline spraying into a flickering spray of light against the gravel, each droplet igniting and scattering like a swarm of angry fireflies. Sparks hissed as they scorched the ground, and the sudden heat radiated against Tasha's face like an accusation. The barn's side remained largely untouched, but the threat had been clear. Any strike that caught the soaked boards would send arc to flame. "Fall back," she warned, her voice cutting through the hiss of fire. "I won't warn you again." The three men halted, faces aglow with a dangerous mixture of fury and surprise as they recognized her willingness to confront them head-on. Doug, though still stunned by the fire's abrupt flare, recovered first. His shoulders rose in a silent snarl as he hurled his hat aside and charged at Tasha with a guttural roar. She met him with the sure-footed grace of a combat veteran, pivoting on her heel and using his forward momentum to slam him against the barn door. The crack of flesh on wood echoed across the yard as he crumpled, breath leaving him in a harsh rasp. His boot scrambled for purchase on the dusty ground, but Tasha pressed him further, driving her knee into his midsection in a move so precise it left him gasping as though all the air had been sucked from his lungs. He sagged against the wood, clutching at his ribs where shadows swiftly spread beneath his shirt. Ratso, lips peeled back in a furious grin, drew a small pistol from behind his belt, pressing it forward as though he believed his weapon alone could shift the balance. "Get her!" he snapped, but Tasha did not flinch. She took one step back, lowering her shotgun and catching Ratso's wrist in a sudden twist that sent him stumbling forward, the pistol clattering against the gravel as though its temper had turned against him. She pinned him to the ground with the smooth efficiency of a practiced soldier, her knee anchored at his shoulder as she wrenched his arm behind him. Ratso's breath rasped against the gravel, each exhalation shallow as Tasha's forearm pressed against his wrist until it cracked beneath her grip. "Not tonight," she said into the swirl of his anger, her voice calm enough to belie the tension coiled in her muscles. Billy seized the moment at the edge of the barn siding, raising a crowbar above his head with both hands. His face was a mask of vindication as he slammed the crowbar downward in a vicious arc aimed at Tasha's head. But Aunt Lorraine, who had appeared on the porch with a shotgun held low, met Billy's attack before Tasha could react. With the certainty of long-accustomed resolve, Lorraine stepped forward, the shotgun's butt snapping against Billy's temple in a resounding crack that echoed like a judge's gavel across the night. He slumped to the ground, unconscious before he hit the gravel. A groan escaped his lips, but he did not stir again. The crowbar clanged against the porch railing, tumbling into the grass as Lorraine stood watchful in the porch light's glow, the shotgun's barrel trained at the farmhouse's perimeter. Though Billy lay prone and Ratso's arm was secured beneath Tasha's knee, Doug shuddered upright, wincing at the pain coursing through his abdomen. He managed a strangled gasp as he lunged at Tasha once more, desperation fueling his attack. She sidestepped, twisting her leg into a sweeping kick that caught him behind the knee, sending him tipping against the barn door, where he slumped in a stunned heap. Before he could regain his footing, Tasha's shotgun snapped into his side, pinning him against the wood, as though it were a titanium press, crushing his will. "Enough," she said, her voice unwavering even as her muscles trembled from the relentless intensity of the fight. Each beat of her heart echoed in her ears, a reminder that the danger had nearly consumed them all. Blood still slicked Tasha's forearm where Ratso's punch had opened a line of crimson, and her ribs throbbed with a dull ache from Billy's tire-iron strike. Yet there was no time to acknowledge the pain. Doug, his vision blurred and fists trembling, rose from his heap against the barn's side, eyes alight with a desperate hunger to finish what he had started. He lurched forward, body skewed as though broken parts refused to bend properly. And with a roar that cracked the night, he lunged at Tasha with the edge of a hatchet he had retrieved from the vehicle. The blade glinted in the torchlight, wicked and hungry, as he swung it in a vicious overhead arc. Tasha's senses flared. She caught sight of the blade's arc at the last possible instant and twisted hard, the shotgun slipping from her grip as she pivoted, so that the hatchet glanced past her shoulder and buried itself deep in the barn's wood with a deafening crack. Dust pounded her lungs as Doug staggered off balance from the miss, and Tasha seized the moment to crush her knee into his abdomen. The impact echoed through her limbs, a shock wave that folded him in half with a groan that rattled the still air. But Doug's desperation carried him onward. With iron resolve, he shoved himself upright again, eyes darting to the still glowing embers of gasoline on the ground. If those caught flame, the barn would become an inferno, and Aunt Lorraine's home would go with it. He lunged once more, this time aiming to knock her against the barn's rough surface and wrest the shotgun from her grasp. Tasha met him head-on. She jabbed her elbow into his collarbone, bone grinding beneath flesh, then hooked his arm with a swift motion that drove him backward into the barn door. Wood splintered beneath his weight, and he staggered on uneven boards. The wind knocked out of him with every blistering impact. Behind Doug, Ratso gurgled in futile defiance as Tasha's knee loosed his bound arm from beneath her, snapping it harshly as she stood. With a snarl, Ratso twisted out from where she pressed him, ripping one hand free enough to lunge at her with a shard of broken glass. The jagged edge caught the moonlight, and Ratso's face curled in a feral snarl as he lashed out, aiming for Tasha's throat. But her reflexes, forged in combat drills and countless rehearsals, kicked in. She pivoted, the glass slashing a shallow line across her cheek that bloomed warm and red, but she barely registered the sting. With precision honed by Marine combatives, she delivered an upward elbow strike into Ratso's jaw. The crack of bone meeting bone echoed as he buckled, and Tasha seized his arm, twisting until he yelped, toppling onto the gravel with a grunt that trembled into unconsciousness. Blood trickled from his split lip, staining the ground beneath him in a dark halo. At her side, Billy's groan cut through the chaos as he attempted to rise from the grass's edge, spine arched with pain from Aunt Lorraine's shotgun butt. He shook his head, vision blurred and eyes unfocused, but the instinct to join the fray propelled him upright. He reached for Doug's hatchet, still embedded in the barn, yanking it free with a spray of splinters. Tasha's breath caught as Billy glared at her with the ferocity of a cornered predator. She launched herself forward with a brutal charge, forcing Billy to meet her assault mid-swing. The hatchet slammed into her shoulder with a dull thud, pain flaring hot and white as wood and metal snapped against her flesh. Instinctively, she gripped the hatchet's handle, twisting and wrenching until Billy's shoulders slumped and his entire body folded in on itself with a gasp that echoed in the hush. Their combined weight sent them sprawling onto the gravel, the hatchet clattering away into the dust. Tasha rolled free before Billy could recover, but her ribs screamed with a fresh wave of agony each time she drew breath. She staggered to her feet, forcing her vision to focus even as she felt a hot wave of dizziness wash over her. Billy groaned, struggling to rise, but Tasha's eyes were steel. She lunged, driving her knee into his chest in a motion so swift it felt as though she had become an extension of her own weapon. He skidded backward, eyes panning wildly as he lost his footing and collapsed against the barn's far corner. All around them, the gasoline fumes had ignited in small, sputtering blooms of flame that cast eerie shadows against the battered wood. But the fire had not yet reached the main structure. The night air crackled with tension, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Aunt Lorraine, still on the porch with shotgun trained at the trio, took advantage of their momentary disorientation. She raised the barrel toward Billy's ankle, sending a sharp report echoing across the yard as a slug tore through his boot and embedded itself in the barn's siding. He convulsed with pain, his body spasming as he collapsed to his side, clutching at the splintered wood. Tasha, refusing to allow even a breath of space for them to regroup, charged Billy's prone form, gathering both her fists into a tight burst of fury. She unleashed a flurry of strikes, elbows, palms, and fists, driving bone into bone, hammering his ribs and collarbone until his moans shattered into ragged, defeated silence. Each blow echoed her promise to Maya. No harm would come to her daughter, while Tasha still drew breath. Behind her, Doug, his face twisted in agony from his earlier blows, dug deep to push himself upright once more, but Tasha was already upon him again. She jabbed her forearm into his throat, the impact hollow and unyielding, and he choked, sputtering against the harsh flush of pain. Doug's knife clattered to the ground as he flailed for purchase in the dust, and Tasha seized the moment to deliver a swift, crushing kick to the base of his skull. He hit the earth like a rag doll, spine arching in a final shapeless curve before he went still, breath rattling out in one final, anguished sigh. With all three men now finally silent and broken, the only sound was the crackling of the small fires that had begun to lick at the barn's lower panels. Aunt Lorraine descended from the porch, her eyes shining with a blend of fear and unwavering pride, as she placed a firm hand on Tasha's shoulder. The thunder of distant sirens rose steadily, mingling with the hiss of the smoldering barn. Ratso's bound form lay on the gravel, mindless of the flames creeping along the faint outline of gasoline, but Billy and Doug were so incapacitated that deputies could approach without risking sudden violence. Black SUVs bearing Department of Justice insignias rolled silently onto the gravel driveway as the first tendrils of dawn began to soften the night sky. The diesel engines idled in a steady hum, and federal agents spilled from the vehicles like a tide surging toward shore. Deputy Mills stood at the edge of the porch, his uniform crisp against the muted farmhouse siding, as he and Agent Carter moved to secure the three men. Ratso, now shackled and gaunt, was propped against one of the SUVs. Billy and Doug sat on the ground beside him, their faces hollow reflections of the brutality they had endured. One by one, the agents read each man his rights, their voices carrying clearly through the morning air as Maya watched from Aunt Lorraine's side. The child clutched her rabbit toy to her chest, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief, while Aunt Lorraine's free hand squeezed Maya's fingers in a silent reassurance that the nightmare was coming to an end. Tasha stood near Mark Reynolds, her former commanding officer, whose calm presence felt like an anchor amid the chaos. He placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "You did good," his words low but laden with pride. The reassurance sent a warm flush through Tasha's chest, mingling with the exhaustion and adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Behind them, agents guided the three men toward the awaiting SUVs. Cracked fingers gripped Ratso's wrists as he stumbled forward. His head hung low, and his expression betrayed a fierce defeat. Billy and Doug shuffled behind him, their bodies bruised and battered, lines of shame etched into their posture as they passed under the glaring scrutiny of every agent present. Inside the farmhouse, the front door swung open to admit Crystal, her shoulders trembling beneath a simple cotton dress. She clutched a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and supported her brother with the other. His face was haggard, eyes rimmed dark from fear and tears. As they stepped into the living room, Tasha crossed the threshold with determined strides, wrapping Crystal's brother in a quick, comforting hug. Crystal's tears spilled freely as she offered the wildflowers to Tasha, her voice quavering. "Thank you for saving us. For saving him." Tasha accepted the bouquet with a gentle nod, brushing a tear from Crystal's cheek. "You did the right thing," she replied, voice steady. "Your brother is safe now." Crystal's shoulders sagged in relief as agents arranged a makeshift interview station in the very living room where Tasha had trained Maya to seek refuge. Folding chairs and a small folding table appeared as though conjured by command, and Tasha moved to sit, her back straight as she prepared to give her formal affidavit. She signed each sheet of paper with a practiced hand that belied the hours she had already endured. The first affidavit described the initial diner altercation, the parking lot scuffle, and Sheriff Thompson's refusal to act. The second detailed Crystal's confession and the exact plan the gang had formulated to burn Aunt Lorraine's property. The final form recorded the events at the barn, the gasoline, the pitched battle, and the moment Aunt Lorraine's shotgun had felled Billy. Tasha's pen scratched across each line until her hand ached, but she remained resolute, knowing that every detail would stitch together the narrative that would secure justice. Agents watched with solemn attention, occasionally exchanging nods as they recognized the gravity and precision of her testimony. Once the affidavits were complete, Agent Carter escorted Tasha and Mark to the porch, where Ratso was led outside for a recorded statement. The early morning light cast his haggard form in stark relief against the farmhouse siding, his chains clinking softly with each step. He was seated on a folding chair beneath the porch light. A microphone held before him as a small camera recorded every movement. Ratso straightened, swallowing as though bracing for a descent into the deepest shadows of his memory. He began haltingly, his voice rich with remorse and fear. "My uncle, Raven, was the informant you delivered in Afghanistan," he confessed, eyes flickering toward Tasha's determined expression. "Billy, he waited for this moment to avenge him. He said he'd burn this place and make us pay." Ratso's gaze drifted to the ground as he continued, each word breaking free as though tears had found their voice. "I was proud of Uncle Raven, until I found out what he'd done. When he died, when you turned him in, I swore I'd make you suffer." Billy promised revenge. His admission echoed in the hush, each syllable a hollow drumbeat of culpability that Tasha felt in her bones. Behind him, Mark's jaw tightened, and Tasha felt a swell of vindication wash over her like a tide reclaiming the shore. A moment later, the gravel driveway crunched beneath the heavy tread of federal marshals moving to shepherd Sheriff Earl Thompson into view. He appeared between two tall marshals, hands cuffed before him, his uniform rumpled and his badge stripped from his collar. His face, normally a mask of polished authority, was now a portrait of disbelief and anger, as though he could not comprehend how the world had turned against him. Agents placed Thompson beside Ratso as though uniting two fallen men from opposite sides of the conflict, one who had picked the matches and one who had sought to snuff out the flames. The charges read aloud by the lead marshal cut through the morning stillness: obstruction of justice and facilitating a hate crime cover-up. Thompson's eyes flickered with shock, his jaw clenched in silent fury as he processed the accusations. "You can't do this to me," he hissed under his breath, voice cracked with rage. "I'm sheriff of Rowan County." The marshal fixed him with a cool stare. "Not anymore." Inside, Aunt Lorraine emerged from the farmhouse doorway, Maya clinging to her side. At the sight of Sheriff Thompson in handcuffs, her prayer beads clicked against her palm as tears of relief and vindication flowed freely down her cheeks. She wrapped Maya in a gentle embrace, breathless with gratitude. Tasha crossed to join them, the early sun casting a halo of light around her battered form, as if affirming the righteousness of her fight. As federal agents loaded Thompson, Ratso, Billy and Doug into separate SUVs, Tasha felt a tight swell of completion in her chest. The men who had once stood defiant before her now slumped in chains, and in that moment, with her daughter and aunt safe behind her, Tasha understood that she had exacted a measure of justice that no corruption or silence could erase. By Sunday afternoon, the news of the arrests had swept through Rowan County with the fervor of a long-awaited storm finally breaking. The Unity Fair sprawled across Aunt Lorraine's front lawn, white folding tables lined up in neat rows beneath colorful cloth canopies, each hosting a neighbor's offering of food or craft. Children ran between stalls, their laughter stitching the still warm air with hope, while adults clustered in small groups, catching up like farmers trading secrets at a market. A hand-lettered banner stretched between two oak trees, proclaiming, "Justice done, all are welcome," and beneath it, fresh bouquets of daisies and sunflowers adorned tables beside casseroles and pans of sweet rolls. Tasha stood behind a simple lemonade stand, just a folding table draped with a bright yellow cloth, pouring tall glasses of her homemade lemonade for visitors who lined up to offer congratulations mingled with apologies. Maya, standing on a small wooden stool beside her mother, handed out cookies with a shy grin, her tiny, brave face illuminated by the late afternoon sun. Each child who approached received a warm smile and a hug before their fingers closed around a cookie, and every adult who paused to thank Maya seemed surprised by the depth of gratitude in her young eyes. Nearby, Crystal and her brother hosted a bake sale, the air around their table heavy with the scent of cinnamon and sugar. Crystal's brother moved slowly now, no longer hounded by fear, but buoyed by the community's goodwill, guiding visitors toward their table of sweet rolls and pies. He offered each guest a quiet nod of thanks, eyes bright with relief, as the neighbors inched forward to place their small bills and coins in the tip jar. Every exchange felt like a gesture of redemption, a community both forgiving and acknowledging the cost of past inaction. Deputy Mills, newly appointed acting sheriff, strolled past the lemonade stand with a warm nod, greeting Tasha with a respectful smile. "Looks like you're running the most popular stand around," he said, lowering himself onto a folding chair beside her. Tasha offered him a glass of lemonade, ice clinking against glass, and he took a sip as though tasting the culmination of their shared effort. "Thank you," she said quietly, voice steady despite the weight of the weekend's events, "for everything you did to see this through." Mills accepted the thanks with a nod. "We finally did what was right," he replied, his gaze drifting toward Crystal's table where her brother stood. "Sorry it took so long." Across the lawn, Aunt Lorraine stood amidst a small crowd of neighbors, her hands gently handing out flyers for a new local shelter initiative, an idea she had barely dared to whisper of until yesterday. The flyers, printed on simple white paper, were titled "Shelter and Solidarity," offering information on how families affected by hate crimes could find housing and community support. As Aunt Lorraine clipped one to the hand of a neighbor who had brought a pot of collard greens, she spoke softly. "We cannot forget those who still suffer. This shelter will stand as proof that Rowan County has changed." Her words floated through the crowd, and one by one, neighbors pressed their own flyers to their hearts or tucked them into their pockets, a promise to help build this new network of care. A rickety stage set against the back porch served as a platform for a local jazz band that had volunteered its afternoon, their saxophonist coaxing warm, honeyed notes into the breeze. Taps of drums and the slide of trombone melded into a peaceful harmony that seemed to bind the fair's energy together. As the band played on, neighbors drifted closer, swaying gently to the rhythm, their sorrow and relief finding expression in the soft undulations of the music. A group of elderly couples stood near the fence, leaning on canes or each other, trading stories of long-ago struggles hushed recollections of times when unity had been just a distant dream. Each nod, each tear, spoke of a community confronting its past so that the future might hold something better. Gradually, people began approaching Tasha, one by one, offering apologies that came wrapped in gratitude. The local grocer, a stout man with a weathered face, clasped Tasha's hand and said, "I'm sorry I didn't say anything when those men started in on you. I was too afraid of losing business." His voice shook, and Tasha gave him a small, forgiving smile. "Thank you for saying that now," she replied gently. "We all make choices. What matters is how we move forward." A farmer in overalls, calloused hands still speckled with dirt, stepped up next. "I helped cover for them when they came asking for work," he admitted, pointing toward the barn's direction. "I was wrong. I'll never turn my back again." Tasha nodded, her eyes soft with understanding, even as her heart remained firm in its conviction that forgiveness would not erase the scars they all carried. Despite the warmth radiating from every corner of the gathering, Tasha's attention kept returning to a folding table set beneath the oaks near the stage. There, flanked by an empty chair, stood a framed family portrait of Raven. Younger by decades, dressed in fatigues and smiling for the camera. Beneath his photograph, someone had carefully placed a simple note, "For those who serve truth." The image seemed to glow under the oaks, Raven's uniform pattern still clear, as though that photograph had captured the last shred of his integrity. Tasha felt her chest tighten as the memory of Raven's pleading eyes flickered behind her lids. His surprise, his betrayal. Tears threatened to spill, but she blinked them away, focusing instead on the moment before her. A community healing, neighbors uniting in a tapestry of shared remorse and collective hope. Maya tugged at Tasha's hand, leaning close to ask, "Mommy, why is Uncle Raven there?" Her small voice trembled with genuine curiosity, and Tasha knelt to lift Maya onto her hip. She brushed a strand of hair from Maya's temple. "He believed in doing the right thing," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Sometimes that costs us everything. This photo is here so we remember why we must always stand for what is right, even when it's hard." Maya nodded solemnly, and Tasha returned her gaze to the portrait. Raven's eyes, fixed in an eternal gaze of conviction, reminded her of the promise she had made and the heavy cost of speaking truth to power. Aunt Lorraine crossed the lawn to place her hand on Tasha's shoulder, sensing the storm of emotion roiling just beneath the surface. "He did not die in vain," she said, voice thick with conviction. "Look around you. This is what he fought for." In that moment, Tasha's tears fell unbidden as a wave of gratitude washed over her, tempered by sorrow for Raven's fate. She pressed her lips together, drawing in a single breath that seemed to still the hum of cicadas and the last echoes of the jazz band's refrain. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of reverence. "We're building something better now." As the afternoon waned into a gentle dusk, neighbors lingered, reluctant to let the day end. They exchanged hugs and shared stories of what had changed in their hearts, forging connections that felt sacred. The fair's energy settled into a quiet hum, like embers glowing after a fire has passed, each spark a testament to the resilience that had brought them here. Tasha stood on Aunt Lorraine's porch, Maya nestled at her side, and watched as families strolled beneath the oaks, clusters of children darting in games of tag. In the distance, the barn's charred silhouette served as a reminder of what had been lost and what had been reclaimed. In the hush that followed, as the last of the lemonade was sipped and the final casserole dish accepted, Tasha felt the weight of the journey settle into her bones, a mixture of grief, relief, and unwavering hope. She met Aunt Lorraine's gaze, and together they stood beneath the banner proclaiming, "All are welcome," their shared determination crystallized in a single truth. Rowan County, had changed, and they would be its guardians. Monday morning in Jackson dawned cool and overcast, the sky a muted canvas that seemed to hold its breath for the day's events. The federal courthouse loomed at the end of a broad, stone-paved plaza, its pillars carved with the promise of justice. Inside, the courtroom fell into an expectant silence as Judge Anderson, a tall figure in robes dark as storm clouds, took his seat on the bench. Murmurs ceased, chairs settled, and all eyes shifted to the raised platform where the trial would reach its culmination. Tasha sat at the front table, flanked by her former commanding officer, Colonel Mark Reynolds, and Crystal, her shoulders squared in determination. She wore a crisp navy suit, once a part of her military uniform, its fabric smooth beneath her fingertips as she held her posture unwavering. At her side, Aunt Lorraine cradled Maya in her lap. Maya's small hands gripped a ragged teddy bear, eyes wide and solemn as though she understood the gravity of the moment. The gallery filled with neighbors, supporters, and press, each whispering as they settled into rows of wooden benches. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, and the room hushed, the air thick with anticipation. The U.S. Attorney rose, adjusting his glasses before speaking in measured tones. Your Honor, we present evidence that the defendants conspired to commit a hate crime that targeted Ms. Tasha Brown, a black single mother whose only crime was her very existence. Their actions included verbal and physical assaults, culminating in an arson attempt on a residence occupied by an elderly woman and a child. He signaled to an assistant, and the large projection screen behind him sprang to life, flickering before settling on a still frame from the Barnes confrontation. The image, gasoline spraying across gravel, flames leaping skyward, hung in midair as a hush rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor continued, "We have video from the diner, witness testimony from Midge the owner, Crystal's courageous confession, and the confession of Mr. Ratso Jenkins himself." He clicked a remote, and the grainy recording from Ratso's interrogation echoed softly. "They blamed me and my uncle, Raven, on that day in Kandahar. They said they would destroy what was yours." Ratso's face, gaunt and defeated, appeared on the screen alongside a younger photograph of Raven serving in fatigues, the words, "For those who serve truth," scrawled beneath it. Gasps fluttered through the gallery as faces turned to Tasha, whose expression remained composed yet unbreakably steeled. When the prosecutor finished, Judge Anderson nodded and turned his gaze toward the defense table, where the defense attorney rose. In a measured voice, he argued that his clients had acted in self-defense of property, painting the Barnes corner as a threatening locus that could have unhorsed them all. He spoke of fear and misunderstanding, as though they were shields to absolve his client's deliberate cruelty. Yet, as he spoke, Tasha's mind traced back to the day in Kandahar, a small, sun-baked village where she and Raven, codenamed Raven, had stood at a crossroads she could never have foreseen. She recalled Raven's quivering voice begging her to believe he sought to reveal corruption, trusted to do what was right, and how her orders had pulled him from obscurity into deadly betrayal. When the defense attorney concluded, Judge Anderson turned to Tasha. She rose, her shoulders squared beneath the tailored jacket, and every bead of confidence she had drawn from her Marine training shone in her stance. The courtroom leaned forward as she approached the microphone. "When I served in Kandahar," she began, voice low and unwavering, "I helped turn over an informant named Raven, who believed corruption was hidden beneath his own allies. I never knew then that Raven was family to those three men." The projection screen shifted to a weathered photograph of Raven in combat fatigues, younger by decades but still regal, a faint smile on his lips. Gasps rippled through the courtroom and Tasha allowed her gaze to drift to the small image of Raven beside a young Billy Carter. Too small to understand, his face twisted in a mixture of reverence and burgeoning anger. She continued, "They did not simply hate me for my skin. They blamed me for their uncle's fate. Their violence was calculated revenge." As she spoke, Maya reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it so tightly that Tasha felt the pulse of her daughter's fear and pride. Aunt Lorraine dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief pulled from her dress, her face etched with both sorrow and resolve. Tasha felt something swell in her chest, vindication tempered by grief, as she recounted the barn fight, how gasoline had laced the wooden siding, how she had stood between them and her daughter, and how those men had come for her with missiles of hate. When Tasha took her seat, the gallery remained hushed as the jury withdrew. Time seemed to stretch into a taut, silken thread that hummed with tension. Finally, Judge Anderson declared, "Will the jury please rise?" The jurors returned to their seats, eyes fixed on the judge's bench. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with tired but resolute eyes, stood and spoke in a clear voice. "We have, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Will the defendant, Billy Carter, please rise?" The courtroom's hush deepened as Billy, gaunt and bound by his own guilt, rose. "How do you find the defendant on the charges of conspiracy to commit a hate crime, assault, and attempted arson?" The jury foreman replied, "Guilty on all counts." A single breathless gasp rippled through the gallery as Judge Anderson repeated the verdict for Billy Carter and then turned his gaze to Doug Wilson. The verdict was the same: guilty on all counts. Finally, he turned to Ratso Jenkins, whose shoulders slumped as though a weight had crushed him from within. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman repeated. Tasha felt her shoulders slump in relief and sorrow, each breath a release of burdens she had carried for too long. Tears shimmered in both her own eyes and those of the spectators, but she forced herself to remain composed, lifting her gaze to meet Mark Reynolds's proud, sympathetic stare. When Judge Anderson rose to adjourn the hearing, the courtroom exhaled as though releasing a held breath. Maya leapt from Aunt Lorraine's lap and hugged her mother, pressing her tiny face against Tasha's leg as though to anchor herself to safety. Tasha knelt to wrap her arms around Maya, whispering comfort between her daughter's sobs of relief. Outside, the murmurs of approval swelled as neighbors emerged to embrace Tasha, to offer congratulations and apologies born of newfound understanding. The legal battle had reached its summit, but for Tasha, the reverberations of Raven's memory, both the triumph of justice and the sorrow at his cost, would echo in her heart long after the courtroom's doors closed behind her. By mid-morning on Monday, the verdict had rippled through Rowan County, and by week's end, federal marshals had transported Ratso Jenkins, Billy Carter, and Doug Wilson to the same federal penitentiary facility. 3 cells that offered neither comfort nor camaraderie. Each man now awaited sentencing hearings under harsh fluorescent lights, faces hollowed with the knowledge that their cruelty had finally met its reckoning. Deputy Mills, who had been appointed acting sheriff in Sheriff Thompson's absence, oversaw the transfer. As he signed the final paperwork, he felt the weight of trust that his community had placed upon him, a trust he intended never to betray. Sheriff Earl Thompson, once the county's highest lawman, did not escape scrutiny. Within days of that hearing, federal investigators delivered a contempt notice to his home, charging him with obstruction of justice and facilitating a hate crime cover-up. Under public pressure, the state's ethics committee convened, and within a month Thompson was removed from office, his law enforcement certification revoked, and his pension benefits suspended. The local newspaper printed his resignation in bold type. "Sheriff Thompson steps down amid federal inquiry." His family estate, once an emblem of influence, now stood silent, echoing with the memory of a man who had chosen loyalty to hate over duty to the law. Despite his protests in inarticulate press releases, his reputation lay in tattered ruins, a stark testament to the price of choosing complicity over justice. Meanwhile, the three men who had once terrorized a mother and child found no refuge in anonymity or remorse. Billy Carter received a 15-year federal sentence for hate crime assault and attempted arson. His cell block, a narrow cell in a facility far from home. Doug Wilson, less culpable for leadership but no less complicit, was given 12 years for assault and conspiracy. Ratso Jenkins, having confessed to personal vendettas rooted in his Uncle Raven's fate, received 18 years in prison. Years that would stretch beyond the lifespans of many he had wronged. Each man's face appeared in the local paper beneath headlines such as "Hate Crime Sentences Handed Down," a stark illustration of the community's will to hold its own accountable. As spring gave way to summer, Rowan County seemed to breathe again, the scars of its recent battles gradually healing beneath the warmth of renewed purpose. 6 months after the sentencing, the local press documented a moment that spoke not of anger and division, but of hope and unity. On a gentle Saturday afternoon, a small crowd gathered on Aunt Lorraine's manicured lawn, now a flourishing tapestry of wildflowers and fresh grass, where a new wooden podium stood draped in a blue cloth bearing the emblem of Raven's Scholarship Fund. Tasha stood behind the podium in a lightweight linen dress, Maya at her side in a sundress the color of a cloudless sky, and Aunt Lorraine seated near the front, clutching a bouquet of daisies. Neighbors arrived bearing casseroles and desserts, tables groaning under the weight of community offerings that spoke of shared history and collective healing. Crystal and her brother stood to the right of the stage, handing out certificates to volunteers who had spent the past months repairing the farmhouse, repainting walls, and planting a small orchard of peach trees to replace the grove that had burned. Each certificate was framed in simple oak, letters proclaiming, "In gratitude for your service to our family and our county." And each volunteer accepted their honor with tears and quiet smiles, as though the act of rebuilding marked their own personal redemption. Deputy Mills rose from a folding chair in the front row and lifted his glass of iced tea. He raised his voice over the soft hum of conversation, calling for attention. "To Tasha Brown," he began, his tone warm and genuine, "who reminded us all that true strength lies in love, resilience, and standing for what's right. Because of her courage, Rowan County has a chance to be better than it was." Glass clinked as neighbors raised their cups in a unison of affirmation, their eyes never leaving Tasha's face, which radiated gratitude tempered by solemn resolve. Tasha's gaze swept across the crowd. Friends who had prolonged apologies at the Unity Fair, neighbors who had watched a mother fight to defend her home, and strangers now bound by the knowledge that they shared a collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable. She took a breath, Mary's small hand slipping into hers, and leaned forward. Every act of courage, big or small, creates a ripple that can wash away hatred, she said, voice resonant enough to carry across the lawn. As she spoke, Maya stepped forward to hand out fresh flowers to each speaker who rose to address the gathering, the child's hands offering daisies and buttercups as tokens of gratitude and unity. Tasha watched her daughter's bright smile and felt a fierce joy that rose in her chest, unmarred by the battles they had fought. Afterward, Tasha moved to unveil a simple wooden plaque mounted on a post near the edge of the lawn, bearing Raven's portrait and the inscription, "Raven's Scholarship Fund, for children of fallen veterans and victims of injustice." As the blue cloth slipped away, the crowd murmured in appreciation, and Crystal's brother stepped forward to speak. "Raven believed in truth," he said, voice steady, though his hands shook ever so slightly. This scholarship will offer hope to children whose worlds have been shaken by loss, just as he tried to offer hope to me. He handed a certificate to a young girl whose father had been wounded overseas, her smile brightening the space between them. When the ceremony concluded, neighbors drifted across Aunt Lorraine's orchard rows to sample pies and lemonade, exchanging stories of how they had known Raven or of how they had stood by as silent witnesses to the county's darker days. Tasha lingered with Maya as Aunt Lorraine pressed a kiss to her granddaughter's hair, whispering a prayer of thanks that mixed with the humid afternoon air. Tasha's heart lifted as she watched magnolia trees, newly planted to replace those scorched in the arson attempt, stand as living symbols of rebirth and perseverance. In the distance, as the sun dipped toward the western horizon, painting the rolling fields of Rowan County in molten gold, Tasha wrapped her arms around Maya and Aunt Lorraine. Her voice hovered in the hush of the moment, a gentle, resolute refrain that marked the end of one chapter and the promise of another. When we face fear with compassion and stand up for the vulnerable, we forge a future where no child has to wonder if their mother will protect them. As the crowd began to disperse beneath a sky alight with fading warmth, Tasha drew Maya close, feeling the steady thrum of her daughter's heartbeat against her own. The journey had been wrought with trials and loss, but in this moment, beneath the summer's fading light, Rowan County stood renewed, its people bound not by hatred, but by promise, resilience, and the enduring belief that love, indeed, could triumph over darkness. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.